Hello. So, I want to talk about a word which I think is almost no help at all when it comes to teaching people how to do what I do, play jazz. And that's the word improvisation. And the reason why I hate it so much is that, first of all, the sort of dictionary definition of it does not match up to the reality. So I've got Cambridge Dictionary up here, and it says improvisation is a performance that an actor, musician, etc. has not practiced or planned. Well, that's completely wrong. Because if you look at my videos, it's all about practicing and planning, preparing how to play. There's a lot of alliteration in that sentence, but how to play tunes, right? This is what you do with this tune. It's a strategy. This is what you can practice. This is what you can learn to do. Okay, and of course many improvisers, so-called improvisers, are lick-based. Where do they get the licks from? Well, they practiced them and they planned them. They worked them out. They set them out in advance. So, this is a word I think that's messing up music education. Improvisation. It's scary. There's lots of people out there who are classical musicians who are terrified by the idea of improvisation. I mean, to me, what I do on a daily basis seems near miraculous, if only they knew, right? And I think part of the reason for that is the history of Western classical music in the 20th century, which is that it jettisoned pretty much all of its improvisation tradition. Now, if you go back far enough, people like Mozart and Bach were improvising sonatas and what have you, preludes, whatever you can imagine. And their writing of music was so fast that it would actually basically match my idea of improvisation straight to paper. If you go to the Mozart Museum in Vienna and look at the original scores that he wrote out, they're almost illegible. They're just about legible, and it's clear that they're written with extreme haste. He doesn't even bother to copy out the treble clef properly. And the reason why he's doing that is not because he's just lazy and he wants to go down the pub, but it's because the fluency and speed was very much part of the musical tradition at that point, and you can find out more about that from Robert Gierdingen's books, and there's a podcast which I'll link to below. But as Gierdingen puts it, the composers of that era, all the professional composers, not just genii like Mozart, but people like, Pergolesi is kind of a genius, but like the sort of thing of second-rank composers of the 18th, 17th, 18th century could all do it as well. Any professional composer could do it. They could all compose really, really quickly, and they all wrote huge volumes of material. And the reason why they were able to do that is because they were combining and recombining a fairly small selection of harmonic progressions and melodies based on those harmonic progressions, and dressing them up and ornamenting them and embellishing them. That sounds familiar. Okay? So for me, there's absolutely no difference between that process and what I do, and it certainly isn't like I'm going to step out on stage and not have an idea of what I'm going to play. Some improvisers are like that, but this represents like the extreme rarefied case. Now, in jazz, obviously people like Miles Davis is well known for having fired his sax player George Coleman because George Coleman was practicing his solos in his hotel room and Miles could hear it. And for Miles, that was not what his band was about. It's like, I'm going to get out on stage and not know what I'm going to play. In practice, it may have been a little bit hypocritical because Miles actually did refine his performances a lot over the course of performance, but that's another story. So that's a famous jazz story. And it's usually meant to mean like George Coleman, was in the wrong there. But I think, most people would agree that George Coleman knows how to play jazz. So his firing by Miles is an indication of a clash of two separate cultures and traditions within jazz, one of perhaps viewing a solo as a prepared composition, and the second one being composition as you sing or play, which is the definition given on Wikipedia. So I think like that is quite a big deal, and there's lots of musicians who famously kind of didn't necessarily walk out on stage and go like, what am I going to do? I don't know. And just play on the spur of the moment. And musicians such as Oscar Peterson, Louis Armstrong, I think Joe Henderson, and quite a few people like that were known for refining there playing and basically working out a solo over the course of several nights, and basically coming up with a refined composition. It just happens that composition wasn't written down. You can compare it to a comedian, stand-up comedian. I when I was quite young, I went to see some live comedy, and I was really impressed and thought, wow, that person's amazing. How can they come up with all these amazing observations on the cuff? And of course, I went and saw them the next night, and it was exactly the same. So that was right away an important lesson. I've worked on courses in so-called free improvisation where there's a lot of preparation going on. The music might be atonal or non-idiomatic, but we have an idea of what we're doing when it comes to the performance. There are textures prepared. It's a compositional way of working with it to make it, into a thing. So improvisation can be used as a source of ideas that are then refined. And actually, for a lot of jazz, and jazz used to be a lot more showbiz, that seems to have been the case for many of the performers. Okay, so that's one thing. Second thing is improvisation. Well, how can you tell whether somebody's improvising or not without sort of playing with them or hearing them on consecutive nights? And the truth is that you don't know, because the human mind is like a black box. You can't look inside of it. You can't tell what I'm thinking right now, for instance. So like that sort of, that unknowability creates a mystique around the process of improvisation. And the word improvisation, basically, and I think in most Western musical circles, means stuff that isn't written down. But if I can kind of elucidate that a little bit further, imagine a spectrum of non-written down music. So this is music, that's just based around ears and around playing or singing. On one side of the spectrum, we might have, for instance, a folk tune, which is something that's communicated orally from musician to musician, but is not an improvisation. Now, of course, many folk musicians might add improvisation to their version of that tune, and that tune might slowly change over time due to little embellishments becoming a part of the thing because people like them, So, I mean, you can hear different versions of the same melody from different regions, or at least you could, but back when there was less mass communication. And that will create a sense of organic evolution in the composition. That's a feature of folk music generally. And jazz is an interesting position of being a folk music that came up in the recording age. On the other hand, you can have people who just go out on stage and don't know what they're going to play before they play it. We might include, Miles Davis's Ideal, if not the reality of his actual playing. Sonny Rollins is quite famous for this. People like Evan Parker and Derek Bailey, obviously. So that is, a whole spectrum. And in the middle, you might have people like Oscar Peterson or Louis Armstrong who at least work out chunks or sections and then maybe, refine their playing, their improvisations, so-called improvisations, over the course of several nights. It's not necessarily a right or wrong here. I would suggest that the general progression of the teaching of improvisation, as so-called improvisation, should go from the right to the left, so you become freer. And you might start off just by learning melodies of tunes, and then maybe learn how to embellish them or alter them, then maybe pick up some licks, vocabulary and language, and eventually start coming up with your own licks of vocabulary and language, and eventually become a freer improviser. And I feel that's kind of the direction which I more or less followed, with some hiccups at the start. So that's a big thing, I think. And it's this idea that improvisation is just something which isn't written down is actually much closer, I think, to people's usage of it in the everyday than, say, for example, the Cambridge Dictionary definition. So, and I think, like, as soon as if you were to explain that to a classical musician, they'd find it a lot less intimidating to improvise. So if you say to them, okay, well, here are 3 or 4 blocks of information, that you can use to make up a composition, and then you ask them to combine them, and then you give them like a limited series of choices. They're not faced with a blank page problem, and that's the biggest problem. Like for any improviser or composer, is looking at a blank page and going, "What shall I write?" And most experienced composers and improvisers have a whole bunch of ideas, a whole suite of ideas, not a whole sweet bunch of ideas, although they would be sweet because you'd like them, but a whole load of ideas of how to start a piece or how to start an improvisation or like some kind of ear-grabbing thing that they might do, gesture, and so on and so forth, and then in composition you can always go back and change it later, but the main thing is to start the process of writing the thing, right? Improvisation, obviously, you don't have the unless you are playing several nights in advance, you don't necessarily have the what's the word, luxury of going back and editing it. So that's a really big thing, I think. I think like that's one reason why I don't like the Jamie Aebersold approach. It's what I started with. Probably a lot of people watching this channel. Okay, so I mean, you are constraining choices in some sense, in the sense that you say, here are 7 notes that work over the chord. The problem is, I think 7 is too many notes. I think maybe what Jordan Clemens is doing with 4 notes might be more like the sort of thing. I certainly find it easier to work with 4 notes than with 7. There's so many combinations with 7, and then also, when the chords start coming thick and fast, that's a lot of choices very quickly, which means that people who kind of learn that way can sometimes get intimidated by tunes like rhythm changes, which really aren't that complicated when you look at them in the right way. So I think just developing that way, just like taking out of one's head the idea that you should just be able to make up music right away, at least at the start, and focusing on learning language is a really good way to go. In fact, I get my students to compose things because that's where Barry Harris sort of teaches it. He composes it. His way of teaching improvisation is to compose things in the class and sing them and play them to the usually sing them to the workshop, and then the workshop copies, and that's how they learn how to improvise. I mean, that would be like anathema to a lot of jazz educators I know, but it works, So if you compose something, and then if you can take that composition and vary it and change it, then you're much more likely to be able to become a fluent improviser than if you just try to make stuff up in the moment. So I think improvisation is not necessarily the best way to practice improvisation. Anyway, I'm going to cover that a little bit more in the video that was requested by the poll, which is how to go from scales to language. Because language to me is very important. And again, language has a very useful analogy to music. So for instance, we all improvise when we speak. I'm speaking according to a rough plan, but not every word is planned out. That's a form of improvisation, but it's not like I've just sat myself in front of the camera and said, I'm just going to talk. I don't know what I'm going to talk about. I have a subject, and I have in my head some bullet points about what I'd like to discuss, and I'm a fluent enough communicator in the English language to be able to do that in a reasonably kind of open way. Now, obviously, if you're learning a new language, you're not going to have that kind of vocabulary. You're not going to be able to make conversation, for instance. So, therefore, you've got to start with common usages and phrases that will be useful in the everyday. Things like, my name is. Can you show me the way to? Can you give me directions to? Could I have 3 beers? That kind of thing, the sort of stuff you learn in early language classes. Later on you get into vocabulary and grammar and so on, and you learn a bit more about the structure of the language, how it's put together, so you can come up with your own sentences and you can understand more sentences. And then eventually you might learn more about idiom and become a fluent speaker, okay? And music is exactly like that, especially the bit where you actually have to go and live in the country, So if you look at it from the point of view of a language, it all makes a lot more sense. And I feel like what I've missed from sort of the kind of beginning improvisation classes and stuff is a little bit of that kind of sensibility, at least in my experience. I'm sure there are teachers who don't do it that way. And I think for classical musicians interested in getting into improvisation, I think just put the whole word improvisation out of your head and think about putting yourself in a position where you can make limited choices about performance, such as the order of sections of music or particular strands of melody that you might have already prepared, and then go from there. Anyway, I hope you find that interesting. Might be a little controversial even. If you disagree with me, please post below. I'd be interested to know your thoughts. Not everybody obviously learns in the same way. Some people are happy to take the plunge and jump in and start improvising right away. Not everybody's intimidated by the concept of it. But I think even so, that link that we have in Western culture between improvisation and jazz is not necessarily that helpful, because of course you don't need to be a jazz musician to improvise. And again, if somebody coming from, say, the classical tradition thinks that in order to learn to improvise they have to learn how to play jazz, it's going to be, have a double thing to overcome.